when you're your own, when you pick up those skills. And of course, I'm sure that the professors are going to expose you to the best of the pieces of writing or production, and then the best of the most important theories that you must be aware of in journalism. And then you will get to learn as you go. Since it has an aspect of paper presentation, let me get into the formal business of Keynote and the paper presentation. Early last year, the chief editor of a mainstream media house in Delhi took me out for a meal. Let's call him TKTKG. So this TKTKG shared with me the pressure he gets regularly from the Modi government. Of course, you know that if you're in the field of journalism more so, and just generally also, that journalism is dependent quite directly to the political climate of any country or any particular government and so forth. So there are pressures that, of course, journalists work under. So this TKTKG told me about a call once he received after a caravan story. So the caller said, "Adhish ji, aapse baat karenge." The president will talk to you. The caller had said actually in a very authoritative voice, and then of course the editor was taken by surprise and wondering who is this Adhish ji, right? So then comes the voice, "Main Amit Shah bol raha hoon." I'm Amit Shah speaking. Amit Shah at that time was the national president of the BJP, and of course this was a little early in 2019, early last year, and undoubtedly the second most powerful person in India since 2014. So he told the editor, "See, look, there is a press conference which is going on of the opposition leader, and you should skip it. You should not publish the news report on that." And our editor tried to sort of tell him, like, look, he's an opposition leader, and it's a major story that he's holding a press conference on. I can't black him out. But of course, the party president did not quite like it, and then the editor told me that he published a matter-of-fact report at the end. Now, when you think of actually the audacity of politicians to call up an editor, most of you shouldn't know that the media landscape actually is reflective of what kind of powers that exist. Sometimes it's corporate power, sometimes it's political power. Advertising plays a huge role. And these are, I think, I'm sure that as part of media literacy that you will get exposed to. And this is coming to a stage where often there is a pushback generally from society, and we see that India has, if not an exceptionally great media freedom culture, it has been from time to time faring reasonably well. I mean, we have episodes that we can recall from history, let's say in the 1980s, late 1980s, when the Hindu would publish the papers on the Bofors defense deal. There would literally be a stampede. The Indian Express and India Today and all of them would send their best reporters to Sweden and get more papers or more accounts out. Similarly, when early 2000s, when Helka published stung the sort of leaders of Vajpayee establishment, you could see, the national press was covering it by and large. The Manmohan Singh era, you'll see the same thing. Most of the news organizations were putting forward their best minds, their best reporters to cover, whether it's 2G scam or Colgate or Commonwealth. So there was a conversation. The journalists were competing with each other, and the news organizations were competing to put the best stories out on the front pages. Now you see a huge dip in 2014, and this I speak from somebody who work from within the industry ecosystem. And I think there's this so-called Adhichji call to the editor friend, colleague in some sense in the profession, was quite revealing why I've been wondering that why most of the big stories that we publish, for example, whether it's the mysterious death of Judge Lawyer, who was hearing the Shorabuddin encounter, fake encounter case in which Amit Shah was the prime accused. I mean, Caravan did stories and broke stories of Judge Lawyer test and did a series of investigations, 30 or so. Or the Rafale defense deal, which we consistently broke a number of stories, or the booming business of Amit Shah's son, Jay Shah. Now, most of the stories you see that, often there was no interest that we had seen in the 1980s or 90s. And if at all there was interest, it was after a political response or a judicial response. And then you would go cover the response as journalism. You wouldn't have the stampede that I said we had seen in the Manmohan Singh era of putting the best journalists and advancing the story. Of course, we would like competition in the profession or with any story. I mean, that's how journalism thrives. If New York Times is chasing Pentagon Papers, of course, Washington Post and the editor puts the best journalists to get the papers. And if you watch the movie The Post, you will get to see the details of some of this sort of drama behind the scenes. That's how journalism works. I mean, you have a big story, you put the best journalists in your team forward. So what we are seeing in the past 6-7 years, for example, is that there is clearly a lack of interest, so to speak. One is when you consider it as a job, a mere job. You have job placement cell, you have job offers, and you consider it's like a job. Then you have the other extreme, the opposite of it, the calling. People who consider it as something of a calling, worthy to live, worthy to sort of be passionate and enjoy all the time, to be on the side of truth and to hold people accountable, be a custodian of, so to speak, of the good old values of what this 450-year-old industrial production of what the newsroom is supposed to do. So this is mostly of the calling. And in between is what we can call the profession, right? So you have the job, the profession, and the calling. And let me try to share a screen here. So you have the calling, you have profession and job, right? And then what do you have on the other axis? You have, following the narrative, and you have puncturing the narrative. You find problems in the narrative, you scrutinize the narrative, you have a strong bullshit detector. If somebody is saying that there is no unemployment, or we have, people are living happy, then of course it's the duty of the journalist to look into data and then scrutinize it. So you have, on the one hand, following the narrative, and in some cases people actually become party to, in advancing the narrative. They actually feel committed. So at the job end, you fall back to the sort of following the narrative, and then at the calling end, you actually risk probably your job, risk yourself, your life, your family's health, and then be at the calling end. Now, how has our journalism fared mostly? I mean, this is sort of a qualitative analysis and the perception that we have in the industry. If you can see the years there, you can see most of, especially in Indian journalism, have been fluctuating between job and profession. And there are a bunch of years that you can see that probably around profession, that there is a great deal of freedom, that there is a great deal of need, that the ecosystem is, it's not destroyed in some sense. But the moment that you come to the emergency under Indira Gandhi, or the years when there were actually proper censorship in place, announced, declared censorship in place, or the time that we have in the last 6-7 years where there is not exactly an announced declaration of any state control or the ruling ideology controlling, but we know that a number of editors lost their jobs who are independent. A lot of reporters who are consistently breaking big stories are let go. Um, and also big stories are not being chased. Now, um, it's also, you will also notice that there are very few years that we can count closer to the calling space. Now, of course, there will be exceptions with a few individuals or with a very short period in one organization. But by and large, when we look at our culture of the national press, we see mostly it is closer to job and profession, somewhere in between. So this is something that we can keep in mind. This is the culture that we come from, and we represent an ecosystem where our standards have been fixed mostly by the constraints and the legacy that we have. And this is very strange in another sense, because this is, we also had a robust history before independence. And then that history, of course, will tell us, any historian of modern India will tell you that 75% of our freedom fighters were journalists, and this is very unique, I think, mostly for India. They were writers, they were bringing out little magazines and journals and newspapers. Most of them had some kind of an association with publishing, printing, and they would disseminate it. Now, but then what has happened to that tradition? Subsequently, I think post-independence, you have the British-owned news organizations selling themselves, whether it's Times of India or many of those organizations, to rich Indian corporations or families who could afford them. And then most of them were, of course, there is no previous history or commitment to the values of journalism, and they acquire it and then run it like any business. It could be like an extension of their mining business or real estate business. And so you see most of those organizations bringing in a certain kind of culture to the ecosystem. Then you also have a lot of big brands, like even the Indian Express, which in fact was not started by Goenka, but started by a journalist. But Goenka comes in as a money lender, and then he's a mining guy, and then he takes over Express because the journalist who started it could not run it, and the money lender increases his stake in the company. Now, again, there is a certain kind of commitment that you see from time to time. When somebody is in power, there is some vendetta. When somebody is in power, their primary business is in trouble, so you go after them or use it cleverly sort of to negotiate room for themselves. But then this culture, post-independence, has gotten us to a place where today, if you look at the character of most of the news owners, we have oilmen who are owning newspapers, we have telecom men, we have mining people, we have people who produce cement, money lenders, defense middlemen, politicians. These are the people who are primarily the character of news organizations, who are the owners of news organizations. So that's something that we must keep in mind as practitioners of, as consumers of journalistic content as well. Many of you probably wouldn't end up being practitioners. That's perfectly fine. And some of you who would like to end up in journalism would actually be wondering, if this is the ecosystem, what's the point in even getting there? Why should one go there to risk? This is not. There's a compromise which you sign up for it initially, and then why do you need to? In fact, I would, if any of you are interested in a paper where I basically deal with this aspect of why you should take up still a job in most of these news organizations, in spite of knowing that these are organizations which could be compromised in some sense. You should take it up. There are reasons that I outlay as, to pursue 5 cornerstones of journalism. And of course, there is a great deal of learning which is required. So there is, you can use it as an opportunity to grow yourself and to bring in more gravitas and weight to your understanding of subject, and then, learn at the expense of somebody. And of course, you are producing journalism. So these are 5 values which I'm sure If you're interested, you can find it online, but I can also share it if you're interested. The news instinct, this is something that you need to grow. The sound judgment, the moral courage, and subject area expertise and craft. Now, these are things that you should definitely um, um, work on to become a good journalist or become a better journalist. Now, there is some room that you can still negotiate in any of these organizations, putting it to practice when you're at the city desk, when you are at the mid-level. And even some of those stories, of course, might get you in trouble, but then you move on to another organization. But there will definitely be a time where you might still be asking the question, this is not why you signed up to be a journalist, and then how would you sort of see yourself in the profession? Um, this is where I think, again, the kind of new ecosystem that we have of learning, and I see I don't see this um, political sort of suffocation, so to speak, generally, not just in India. Many countries you see leaders emerging in countries which thought that many of the conversations on basic values of freedom of press and rule of law is set. You see, strongman leaders are emerging. I mean, people moving far away from democratic values and so forth. So it's not unique only to India, but since we are in India, we speak generally in the terms of what the media culture here is. And many of you who are out there and wondering what is that we are going through, I see this as a great opportunity for you to sort of workshop on two aspects, and this will definitely get us to a better media culture place one day. And I think we have to keep this insatiable optimism, and then that's what history teaches us. And of course, there are spells that even in the graph that you saw, there are years like 1975, 76, 77, but then there are years where we see bouncing back. And if that has happened of back and forth in time, it will happen in future again. There is no reason why that pattern in history wouldn't get itself repeated. But the most important question is, will you be prepared to harvest that then? For you to harvest it then, you need to sow it now. And sowing the seeds now, mostly I would say can be put into kind of two kinds of workshopping that you can do it to yourself. And one is that there is a great deal of workshopping which is required on the business model of news organizations. Now, it doesn't mean that in the olden days, that's also the way industry has worked. Everyone considered it as a job and a profession and so forth. So the responsibility of running an organization was given to the managers, to the executives, the people who are on the non-journalistic side. But there is a increasing deal of responsibility that you can see, which I think anyone who will enter this profession need to carry. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to think of setting up a BuzzFeed or a New York Times or a Huffington Post. No. In fact, there are lessons that one can learn from each of those different trajectories, and then see what has worked and what has not worked. You are aware of the fact that the sort of some of the corporate run model leads to compromise, and then that's not necessarily the best model. The family run companies, except a few exemptions, more or less has failed in a country like India. And some of these sort of venture capitalist funded news models like BuzzFeed and HuffPost, you see that globally they have been seen as sort of not good models. They've laid off thousands of staff, journalists in the last 2 years. And then of course the hedge funders, the venture capitalists expect a certain return on their investment. And then you see that journalism is not like any businesses, like construction or some speculative business where you could grow your money overnight over 5 years. It doesn't grow. It is a social call. It's that there is a reason why it's called like fourth pillar in democracy. It's not, it doesn't render itself into business that easily. It can look after itself well if you manage the organization well, but it doesn't make good business sense. The hedge fund models, BuzzFeed and HuffPost and Wise, have gotten a lot more realistic these days, and then people are not putting money there anymore on those models. But then what has worked? I mean, there are positive things to look at from all these ecosystems, is that the new models for media actually is pretty much the old model in media. What is that? That is going back to subscribers. And news organizations like The Guardian, for example, over 200 years today, was started as a collective of workers, in the textile and other companies in England. Now that became a big news organization. Now, or even even look at the New York Times, for example. I mean, it was in huge crisis some years ago, and I was looking at the financials, and last year it reported 140 million profit, and riding hugely on a subscription drive. So it also recorded in the Corona months. It recorded the biggest ever subscription growth. Over 600,000 subscribers in 3 months. Now, and this from small units of even just rupees 14. If you are in India and subscribing to the New York Times, the smallest purchasing unit is rupees 14 for a week. And of course, from country to country, they might have different slabs. Now, this has led to New York Times being a very profitable news organization today. Of course, they have reduced on the advertising staff, and they have let some people go in the advertising department, but the journalistic department has remained intact, and the news organization as a company has made more profit. Now, and it's when it comes to, I mean, this New York Times story, I remember a little anecdote. I mean, this 18 years ago when I was working for US Public Radio as a producer in Delhi. There was a reporter in New York Times in Delhi who was quite, what do we say, representative of the old legacy news behavior. And what does that mean? I mean, of course, some of us who are in public radio, it's completely listener-supported news model in most of the Western countries. And US particularly, public radio is supported by listeners or smaller family foundations and so forth. So of course, a journalist is aware of the fact that you are not supported by a big daddy or a big corporation. And also there is very little pressure from the advertisers. And there was a colleague who was visiting from Afghanistan, and we were having a little evening rendezvous. And then the New York Times reporter was peeping into our conversation, and we were talking about some well-meaning individuals in Delhi who could actually contribute to the public radio. And the New York Times reporter was, the pompous reporter was wondering, oh, this is not why, this is what we would ever end up doing. We have established departments who will actually go to advertisers, and advertising pays for it. And this is when New York Times was a paper which had, substantially huge real estate was dedicated to advertising, and was thriving as a news organization, primarily as an advertisement-dependent model. But today, when you look at it, in fact, it's very interesting to see it's the smaller units of rupees 14. It's in some sense the equivalent of the listener-supported model that New York Times, what has saved New York Times. And 2003, 4, 5 were years that the newspaper was in huge trouble for two reasons. I mean, legacy newspapers like New York Times, one, there's a credibility crisis. They wrongly reported that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, forced a country into war and did justifications through their coverage. Later, they found out that they were lies, and they even let some of the reporters go. There was the crisis of credibility there. Then there was also the crisis of the tech companies coming and taking away the advertising, whether it's classified advertising to brand advertising, they were all disappearing. So by 2006-7, it looked like, and I was in New York then, it looked like if you're there, it was like you were standing in the middle of a cemetery where news organizations were dying. One news organization will get shut down in one city, another news organization, they would be planning to shut it down in a few months, and New York Times was letting a lot of people go and then scale down in operations. But it's very heartening to see they formally took the call sometime, I think in 2011, to move into a business model, which was subscription-based business model. Now, of course, not only that, if you have good journalism, you can sell journalism. And there is a classic quote, in order to sell journalism, you have to do journalism, right? So why should anybody pay for a subscription of a certain newspaper which you don't necessarily value? Or if a story that you don't feel pressed to sort of read that story and come to a conversation, if you're not under pressure, then you're not going to pay for it, right? So there are all this lessons that we can learn from the legacy organization. But also let's look at some of the new trends. Of course, after I told you about Huffington Post and Vice and BuzzFeed, the hedge fund model not working out. But what is actually happening in the last year or so is that there is suddenly, again, going back to the sort of 18th century, 19th century models, before the big advertisers came in, the setting up of small cooperatives are happening in some of the Western countries. There is a news organization which is doing fairly well, very young, too early to say anything, but still, a congregation of 18 journalists who came. This is a sports blogging website. It's Defector Media, and then I think 18 of those journalists, and that I was just reading about them, and then found out that they're, let me just share the screen of, yeah, there you go. So they are having their morning meetings. So one of those regular meetings, the staff members of, and then they're also the owners of the organization that they work. So there's equal share, and then people have come together. And there's also another news organization which is called, it's a new model. It's not necessarily a one organization. It's called Brick House, where I think 9 news organizations have come together and they are selling subscriptions as single unit window. So if you think of a window where you can also read like 9 news outlets, and so from your point of view, you don't need to pay for multiple organizations, and you get everything, the best of everything from all these organizations. And that seems to be working out quite well too. Now, it might not sound anything fancy, but we also know that outside of journalism, for example, we also have in India history of building a huge corporation like Amul, of poor, nondescript milkmen in Gujarat coming together, and of course it was facilitated by a visionary. But there was a movement, a cooperative movement, which has produced one of the biggest brands in the world. Or even in our little neighborhoods, in our small neighborhoods, you can see self-help groups coming together and running grocery shops and coffee grinding mills and so forth. So if there are models which has happened outside of journalism, where individual journalists have come together and formed models, I think going forward in the 21st century, if the corporate model, family-run model, hedge fund model have all compromises, I mean, if you see that they have not worked as much as you would expect in a democracy, going back to readers with subscription model and congregations where people come together, it might be the way forward. I'm not saying that's the way forward, but that's definitely one of the ways forward. And then we have evidences and data to suggest that's the direction that we are going. Of course, there is a great deal of workshopping that is required in business model, and you you can do that in the comforts of the university system that you are in. If you are a music writer, if you are a of course you can work on, you need to give value, of course. And I don't mean to say that, you know, just because you have a graduate degree, you will, you know, people will suddenly feel there is value in subscribing you or supporting you. So you have to build yourself up for that. That leads us to the second point, which is, if you're workshopping on the business model, it's probably the primary thing has to start with workshopping with yourself. So, and there are 3 C's, let's say, because we like these days this, you know, acronyms and so forth. You know, there is of course the craft, the content, and character. Now, these 3 things are vital for a journalist in growing as a journalist, because you need to have the craft, you need to have the storytelling, the writing skills. If you are a reporter, a writer, a print journalist, if you are a multimedia journalist, you need to be good with the craft. Of course, irrespective whether you are a multimedia journalist or a news reporter for print or web, you need to be excellent in your content, your grasp on the content, your ability to have a 360-degree view on the subject, and then go for the story and go for the killing. Then you definitely, again, one of the most important things is the character, the integrity of the journalist, because at the end, the credibility matters in the profession. And then these are things that you need to work on oneself in some sense to get better. And then there is no I mean, of course, the people who could point out in our systems that, you know, one is casteist, or one is patriarchal, and one is classist, and things like that. And there is a certain kind of political correctness notion about one's own self. And I think it's generally important as even as human beings, and if you're not there in journalism, but it's quite important for journalists who are operating in the public intellectual space in some sense, to work on oneself on most of these areas. We are also being shaped by our own prejudices, our own orientations, our homes, our society, our movies, what we see, all shape our condition, our being. So there is clearly a workshopping with oneself which is required.
Thank you, sir, for enlightening us with those words that flow with the essence of experience and expertise. In the current era of citizen journalism and an explosive social media culture, media literacy is a compulsory skill that we all need to develop in order to steer clear of political persuasions and fake news. And the way it was reflected in your address with the most appropriate examples and cases is indeed spectacular. It is not every day that students like all of us get to be on the receiving end of such a dissemination of knowledge. And today, we should all fill our pockets with tons of that. Thank you, sir, for joining us and giving us a chance to enlighten ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you very much.